Cowboy shielded Apache from a burning cabin, and the voice returning next spring shattered silence. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. Jack Thompson had always kept to himself. The land he had inherited, a vast stretch of dry desert, had been his solitude for years. He had come out here to escape, away from the noise and bustle of town life, to live in peace, just him and the cattle. The only things he trusted were the land, his horse, and the long, quiet hours spent working under the hot sun. But that was all about to change. One evening, while he was tending to his chores near the cabin, he noticed the smoke first. Thick and dark, rising against the evening sky. His heart skipped a beat. A fire. The flames had already started to lick the sides of a cabin not far from his. And inside, a woman was trapped. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed his rifle, dashed out of his cabin, and rode as fast as he could toward the blaze. As he approached, the heat hit him first, then the smell of burning wood and the crackling of flames devouring the small structure. There, standing in front of the cabin, was a woman, her face twisted in terror. Jack didn't recognize her immediately, but her eyes, wide with fear, made his heart race. Without a second thought, he dismounted and rushed into the inferno. The fire was intense, and the smoke thick, but Jack's focus was razor-sharp. He reached the woman just as the roof groaned under the weight of the flames. She was too terrified to move, her legs frozen in place as the fire closed in on her. Without saying a word, Jack grabbed her by the waist and hauled her toward the back door. The heat was unbearable, the fire scorching his clothes, but he kept moving, pushing through the smoke until they reached the safety of the clearing behind the cabin. She collapsed into his arms, gasping for air, her face covered in soot and sweat. Jack looked down at her, his breath heavy from the effort, and saw that she was no longer just any stranger. She was Apache. The woman's name was Ayasha. Her tribe had been fighting off settlers for years, and though Jack had heard of them, he had never expected to find one on his land, much less save her life. Ayasha looked at him, eyes wide in disbelief, and Jack knew this wasn't just a simple act of kindness. She had seen something in him that no one else had, and for a brief moment, their fates intertwined. They shared a silent understanding as the night air grew cooler. Jack knew that the kindness he had shown her tonight would be paid back in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As he helped her to her feet, Ayasha spoke softly, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack nodded, but inside, he felt a sense of unease. He had no idea what he had just gotten himself into. As the fire slowly died down in the distance, Jack stayed by Ayasha's side, watching over her until she fell into a fitful sleep. He didn't know it then, but this would be the beginning of a bond that would change his life forever. The next morning, Ayasha was gone. Jack searched for her for hours, but it was as if she had vanished into the desert. He stood by the cabin, the memory of her eyes haunting him, knowing deep down that something bigger was coming. The sound of horses galloping in the distance broke his thoughts, and he turned to see a group of Apache warriors riding toward him. The silence of the morning shattered as they came closer. They had come to return the favor. And so began a story that would unfold over the years, one of redemption, loyalty, and the quiet bond that had been formed between a cowboy and an Apache woman. Jack Thompson would never be the same again. The days that followed were filled with silence. Jack Thompson went about his routine on the ranch, but the memory of Ayasha haunted him. He couldn't shake the feeling that their brief encounter was more than just an isolated incident. Though he had saved her life, he couldn't help but wonder about the deeper connection between them. He kept his eyes on the horizon, waiting, but Ayasha did not return. The wind blew through the tall grass, and the sun set each day with no sign of her. Jack tried to push the thoughts from his mind, but they lingered like shadows in the corners of his thoughts. The weeks turned into months, and the seasons changed. Spring came, bringing with it a fresh breeze and new life to the ranch. Jack had almost forgotten the feeling of that night, the fire, the rescue. Ayasha's eyes filled with fear and gratitude, when he heard the sound of horses approaching. It was early morning, and the sun had just begun to rise. He had been out tending to the cattle when the thundering sound of hooves caught his attention. His heart skipped a beat. He turned and saw a figure on horseback, riding toward him. At first, he thought it was just another settler passing through, but as the rider drew closer, Jack's heart nearly stopped. It was Ayasha. She rode alone, her eyes focused ahead, her face determined. She was no longer the frightened woman he had pulled from the flames. She had changed. Her posture was strong, her presence commanding. She didn't speak as she dismounted and walked toward him. Jack stood there, frozen, unsure of what to say. She looked at him with a steady gaze, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt thick, charged with unspoken words. Then Ayasha spoke. "I have come to return the favor," she said, her voice calm but filled with authority. Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He had saved her life, and now she was here to repay him. But he didn't know how to respond. He had never asked for anything in return. "You don't owe me anything," Jack said, his voice low. Ayasha shook her head. "It is not about owing. It is about honor. My tribe has a way of repaying those who show kindness." Jack was about to say something else when he heard the sound of more horses approaching. He turned to see a group of Apache warriors riding toward them. They moved with precision, their faces painted with the symbols of their tribe. They didn't speak as they stopped a short distance away. Their eyes focused on Jack. Ayasha walked toward them, and the warriors followed her lead. Jack stood still, watching in silence. The group formed a circle around him, their eyes steady and unwavering. Ayasha turned back to face him. "My people have heard of what you did for me. They have come to honor you," she said. Jack was taken aback. He had never expected anything like this. The warriors knelt in unison, a gesture of respect and gratitude. Jack felt a strange sense of awe wash over him. He had never been treated this way before, especially not by a group of Apache warriors. He didn't know how to respond, so he simply stood there, unsure of what to do. Ayasha's voice broke the silence. "We have come to offer you something in return," she said, her eyes meeting his. Jack felt his heart race. What could they possibly offer him? The warrior stood, waiting for her command. Ayasha reached into her pouch and pulled out a small object. It was a silver pendant, intricately carved with symbols he didn't understand. She handed it to him. "This is a symbol of our people's gratitude," she said softly. "It is a token of our honor." Jack took the pendant, his fingers brushing against hers. He looked at the object in his hand, then back at Ayasha. "I don't know what to say," he said. "You don't have to say anything," Ayasha replied. "The gesture speaks for itself." Jack stood there for a moment, holding the pendant in his hand. The weight of the moment settled over him. He had saved her life, and now, in return, he had been honored by her tribe. It was a gesture that went beyond words. As the warriors began to ride away, Jack stood still, the pendant still in his hand. He watched them leave, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and respect. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that his life had changed in ways he couldn't yet understand. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, Jack realized that sometimes, the smallest act of kindness could lead to something far greater than he could ever have imagined. As the weeks went by, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of the silver pendant resting in his pocket. It wasn't just an object, it felt like a piece of something larger, something deeper. Ayasha's return had changed the air around him. The respect her people had shown him left a mark, one that he couldn't ignore. His ranch, once a place of quiet solitude, now seemed like the backdrop to a growing, unwelcome storm. He had always kept to himself, but now, with every passing day, He found himself looking out across the horizon, wondering what the future held. The Apache warriors had left soon after giving him the pendant, disappearing as quickly as they had come. Jack resumed his work, but there was a heaviness in his heart. He had been marked by their honor. It was an uncomfortable feeling for a man who had never expected to be noticed. He had saved a life, and in return, his life had been irrevocably changed. The ranch, which once felt like a safe haven, now seemed to be tied to something far bigger than he had ever imagined. Months passed, and with them, the weather began to shift. The winds picked up, the sky grew darker, and the land began to show signs of the coming summer heat. Jack had gotten used to the silence, the isolation. But one early morning, as the sun barely began to crest the mountains, he heard it again, the sound of hooves. The sound was familiar, but this time it was different. There was something purposeful in the rhythm, something that didn't belong to just any settler or traveler. Jack grabbed his rifle, his instinct taking over, and moved quickly to the front porch. As the riders came into view, Jack's heart skipped a beat. It was Ayasha again. But this time, she was not alone. Behind her, riding in perfect formation, were several Apache warriors. They rode like a single entity, their eyes locked ahead, their movements synchronized with precision. Ayasha dismounted first, her eyes scanning the land before she turned to face Jack. "You have honored my people," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. "Now we must offer you our protection." Jack stood still, trying to process her words. Protection? From what? He had done nothing to deserve this. "You saved me once," Ayasha continued. "Now we return the favor." Jack felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had always prided himself on being independent, on not needing help from anyone. But here, standing before him, was Ayasha, and her people were offering him something he had never expected. They weren't just offering protection, they were offering a bond, a connection that went beyond mere gratitude. It was something deeper. "You don't have to do this," Jack replied, his voice low. "I don't need your protection." Ayasha looked at him with a steady gaze, her eyes unwavering. "It is not about what you need," she said. "It is about what we owe you. And what we owe you, we will repay." Jack didn't know what to say. He had saved her life, but this? This was something entirely different. As the Apache warriors gathered around him, he realized that his life, once simple and solitary, was now forever entwined with theirs. Ayasha's people had come to repay him, and in doing so, they had brought with them something Jack had never expected, a sense of belonging. As the days passed, Jack found himself growing more comfortable with the idea. Ayasha's presence, though unexpected, brought a strange sense of peace. She did not ask anything in return for the protection her people had offered. She simply watched over him, her quiet strength a constant reminder of the bond they now shared. But Jack knew this was only the beginning. The winds of change were blowing, and with them came something Jack wasn't yet prepared for. The Apache people had come into his life not as enemies, but as allies. And though he didn't yet understand what the future held, Jack knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same again. Jack Thompson stood by the porch of his cabin, watching as the Apache warriors mounted their horses and prepared to leave. The spring air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the sound of hooves reverberated in the distance as they rode away. Ayasha remained for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the horizon before she turned back to Jack. She had not spoken much since their conversation about protection, but her presence had become a quiet constant in his life. He found himself looking for her whenever she was not around, wondering what her next move would be. He knew that deep down, she had become a part of his world in ways he couldn't yet understand. Days passed, and the ranch returned to its usual rhythm, yet something was different. The quiet solitude Jack had once cherished now seemed incomplete. His eyes would often wander to the horizon, expecting to see the figures of the Apache warriors riding across the plains. But the land remained still, as though holding its breath. Then, one morning, as Jack was repairing the fence along the eastern boundary, a familiar sound reached his ears. Hooves. He turned to see Ayasha riding toward him, alone. She dismounted gracefully, her eyes scanning the land around her before she met Jack's gaze. "I have news," she said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "The time has come to fulfill our promise." Jack frowned, his mind racing. "What do you mean?" he asked. Ayasha's expression softened, and for the first time, Jack saw something else in her eyes, a hint of uncertainty. "My people have decided to move. We must leave this land." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "Leave?" he echoed, not fully understanding. "Why?" "There are threats that we cannot ignore," she explained. "Other tribes have begun to stir. Tensions are rising, and it is no longer safe for us to stay in one place for too long. We must move to ensure our survival." Jack felt a weight settle on his chest. He had known the Apache lived in a world of constant danger, but to hear it from Ayasha made it all too real. "And what about us?" Jack asked. "What about the bond we share?" Ayasha's eyes softened. "The bond will remain," she said quietly. "But we must part ways for now. It is the only way to keep everyone safe." Jack didn't know what to say. The idea of losing her, of losing the sense of connection they had built over the past few months, left him feeling empty. But he understood. Ayasha's people had their own way of life, their own rules. And he, a cowboy, could never truly understand the intricacies of their world. Ayasha reached into her pouch and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. She handed it to Jack. "Take this," she said. "It is the symbol of our gratitude. We will return when the time is right." Jack unwrapped the cloth, revealing a small, intricately carved stone. It was smooth and cold to the touch, but there was a warmth to it that he couldn't explain. "Thank you," Jack whispered, his voice hoarse. "I will keep it safe." Ayasha gave him a small smile, then turned and mounted her horse. "We will meet again," she said, her voice carrying a promise. "When the time is right." As Ayasha rode away, Jack stood motionless, the stone clutched in his hand. He knew that the world he had known was changing, that the bond they had shared would be tested by time and circumstance. But for now, all he could do was wait, and hope that the future would bring them together once again. The wind picked up, rustling the grass around him, and Jack felt the weight of the stone in his hand. It was small, but it felt heavy with meaning. The Apache people had given him something far greater than protection. They had given him a glimpse into a world beyond his own, a world of honor, loyalty, and respect. And though he didn't know what lay ahead, Jack knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning of a much larger journey. Months passed, and Jack found himself standing at the edge of the ranch, watching the sun dip behind the horizon. The seasons had shifted, and with it, the winds had carried away the last whispers of the Apache's visit. Life on the ranch had settled back into its quiet rhythm. The days were long, filled with work, and the nights were silent, except for the occasional sound of cattle moving in the distance. Yet, despite the solitude, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was missing. The stone Ayasha had given him rested in his pocket, a constant reminder of her, of the bond they had shared, and the promise of their future. He hadn't expected to feel such a deep connection to her or her people, but he did. It was a feeling that had woven itself into his every action, his every thought. Then, one morning, as the sun broke through the early morning mist, Jack heard the sound of hooves again. He paused, his hand resting on the wooden fence, as the familiar rhythm reached his ears. His heart raced. Could it be her? Could it be Ayasha returning? He turned to face the rider, the wind carrying the scent of the desert with it. The figure appeared over the rise, silhouetted against the light. Jack's breath caught in his throat. It was Ayasha. She was riding alone, her posture strong and sure, just as it had been when she left. But this time, there was something different in her eyes. Something more urgent. She dismounted as soon as she reached him, her expression serious. "Jack," she said, her voice steady but with an edge of concern. "We need to talk." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "What's wrong?" he asked, sensing the shift in her demeanor. Ayasha took a deep breath, looking out across the open land for a moment before turning back to him. There is a new threat, she said, her voice low. The enemy tribe has begun to move. They are coming closer, and we are not prepared for what they might do. Jack's brow furrowed. What do you need from me? He asked. Ayasha looked at him with a mixture of determination and vulnerability. We need your help, she said. My people cannot fight alone. We need your strength, your knowledge of this land. You know how to survive out here. You know the land better than anyone. We need you to guide us. Jack stood still for a moment, the weight of her words settling in. He had never imagined that his life would intersect with that of the Apache in this way. He had always kept to himself, never wanting to get involved in the conflicts that raged between the tribes and settlers. But now, he realized, he had been drawn into something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. He looked at Ayasha, her eyes filled with a quiet desperation, and something deep inside him shifted. I'll help you, Jack said, his voice firm. We'll do this together. Ayasha nodded, relief washing over her face. Thank you, she whispered. You don't know how much this means to my people. Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out over the land, the sprawling ranch that had once been his entire world. Now, it seemed so small, so insignificant compared to the larger world outside. He had always prided himself on his independence, on his ability to do everything alone. But now, standing beside Ayasha, he realized that sometimes, the greatest strength lies in standing together. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Jack shared his knowledge of the land with Ayasha, teaching her how to read the signs of the desert, how to track the movements of their enemies, and how to survive when the land itself seemed to turn against them. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Jack felt a strange sense of purpose. The days of solitude were behind him. He was no longer just a cowboy on his own land. He was part of something larger now, something that would require him to fight for more than just his survival. As night fell, Ayasha and Jack stood together, watching the stars above. They didn't speak, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with a shared understanding. The journey ahead would be difficult, but Jack knew he was no longer walking it alone. The days leading up to the confrontation with the enemy tribe were filled with long hours of preparation. Jack and Ayasha spent every moment together, learning from each other. Jack taught her the intricacies of the land, how to move quietly through the wilderness, and how to use the terrain to their advantage. Ayasha, in turn, shared with him the knowledge of her people, the ways of the Apache, their traditions, and the customs that had helped them survive for generations. It was a bond that went beyond mere survival. It was the merging of two worlds, two ways of life, coming together in the face of a common enemy. As the days grew warmer, the sense of urgency intensified. The enemy tribe, the Lakota, had been moving closer, their scouts spotted near the foothills just a few days' ride away. Jack could feel the tension building, not just in the air but in the very earth beneath his feet. Every crack of a twig, every gust of wind seemed to carry the weight of what was to come. Jack had been in countless situations where he had to face down danger, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for something greater. It was a fight for the bond he had formed with Ayasha and her people, a fight for the promise of something better. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a deep orange, Ayasha stood beside Jack on the porch of his cabin. She had been unusually quiet that day, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Jack could see the weight of the coming battle in her eyes, but there was something else. There, too, a sense of resolve. "We are ready," she said softly, her voice steady, though Jack could hear the undercurrent of uncertainty. Jack nodded, his heart heavy. "We'll face them together," he replied. "Whatever happens, we stand as one." Ayasha looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt, but she found none. She stepped closer to him, placing a hand on his arm. "You've become more than an ally to us, Jack," she said. "You've become family." Her words struck Jack deeper than he expected. He had never known the feeling of being part of something so much larger than himself. The idea of family, of belonging, was something that had always eluded him. And yet, here it was, standing before him. "I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow," Jack said, his voice quiet. "But I do know this: we'll face it together, no matter what." Ayasha nodded, her gaze softening. "Together," she agreed. The night passed in silence, the stars above shining brightly, offering little comfort to the weight that hung over them. Jack lay in his bed, his thoughts racing. He knew that in the coming days, they would either succeed or fail, but there was something about Ayasha's words that kept him grounded. The next morning, before the first light of dawn, the Apache warriors began to gather. Jack stood alongside Ayasha, watching as the tribe prepared for the battle ahead. The warriors moved with precision, their movements fluid, like a well-oiled machine. They were a people who had fought for their survival for centuries, and Jack knew that this would be their finest hour. As they set out on horseback, Jack could feel the weight of their trust upon his shoulders. He wasn't just guiding them through the land, he was leading them into battle. The terrain was harsh, the sun beating down on them as they rode through the hills and valleys. Jack had spent his whole life in this landscape, but today, it felt different. Every twist and turn of the trail seemed to carry more weight than it ever had before. It was as if the land itself was watching, waiting for the outcome of this journey. By mid-afternoon, they reached the edge of the Lakota's territory. Jack could see their camp in the distance, a collection of tents and fires. The air was thick with the promise of conflict. Ayasha's warriors gathered around her, their faces serious, their expressions determined. Jack dismounted, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was the moment they had been preparing for. The enemy tribe was just beyond the ridge. They could see the outlines of the Lakota warriors in the distance, their movements sharp and coordinated. Ayasha turned to Jack, her gaze steady. "Are you ready?" she asked. Jack met her eyes, his resolve hardening. "Let's do this," he said. Together, they led their warriors over the ridge, ready to face whatever came next. As they moved over the ridge, the sight before them confirmed their fears. The Lakota had set up camp just beyond the line of trees, the smoke rising from their fires a stark contrast to the otherwise quiet landscape. The warriors, who had been casually scattered around their camp, now stood at attention, eyes scanning the approaching Apache warriors. The air was thick with tension, but Jack could feel something else stirring deep within him, an odd sense of anticipation. It wasn't fear that gripped him, but something more. His heart beat steadily in his chest, each thump reminding him of the choice he had made. The choice to stand beside Ayasha and her people, no matter the cost. As they approached the Lakota camp, Ayasha motioned for her warriors to spread out, each one moving with the same silent precision that had been drilled into them during the days of preparation. Jack followed her lead, his horse steady beneath him as they continued their advance. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft clink of armor and the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. The Lakota warriors, too, had mounted their horses, and Jack could see their leader now standing at the center of the camp. He was tall, his posture commanding, and his eyes locked onto Jack and Ayasha with an intensity that spoke of years of conflict. Jack could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air between them. This was no ordinary battle. This was something personal, something far deeper than just land or survival. It was a clash of two cultures, two ways of life, fighting for their place in a world that seemed to be shrinking by the day. As Ayasha and Jack rode closer, the Lakota leader raised his hand, signaling his warriors to halt. For a moment neither side moved. It was as if the entire world had paused, waiting for what would come next. Then, the Lakota leader spoke, his voice strong and unwavering. "You bring your people into our land, Apache," he called out. "Do you think we will simply step aside and let you take what you want?" Ayasha's eyes narrowed, but she did not answer immediately. Instead, she motioned for Jack to stay back. He understood. This was her moment. She had led her people to this point, and it was her voice they needed to hear. "We do not come to take," Ayasha replied, her voice calm but filled with authority. "We come to protect what is ours, just as you protect what is yours." The Lakota leader regarded her for a moment, his gaze calculating. "And what makes you think we will allow that?" he asked, his tone laced with a challenge. Ayasha met his gaze without hesitation. "Because we have no choice but to fight for our future," she said simply. Jack could feel the weight of her words. She wasn't just speaking for herself, but for every Apache warrior behind her, for every person who had ever fought to preserve their way of life. The Lakota leader seemed to consider her words for a long moment. Then, with a slow nod, he gestured for his warriors to lower their weapons. The tension in the air didn't fully dissipate, but for a brief moment, there was an understanding between the two sides. "We fight then," the Lakota leader said, his voice firm. "But know this, the land we stand on is sacred to us, just as it is sacred to you." Ayasha nodded, acknowledging his words. "We fight for what is sacred," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. Jack felt a strange sense of peace wash over him as the standoff continued. There would be no turning back now. The fight was inevitable, but it wasn't about hatred or vengeance. It was about survival, about preserving what they had fought for, what they had lost, and what they could still protect. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the battle lines were drawn. But instead of the clash of weapons, there was a shared understanding in the air. Both sides knew what was at stake. They were not enemies in the traditional sense. They were two forces fighting for the same thing, freedom. The battle would come soon enough, but for now, all they could do was wait. Jack looked over at Ayasha, who stood with her warriors, her gaze never wavering from the Lakota leader. He could see the resolve in her eyes, and in that moment, he knew that no matter what happened next, they would stand together. And in that unity, they would find strength. The wind had begun to pick up, swirling dust and grit across the land as Jack and Ayasha stood facing the Lakota warriors. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of the moment pressing down on both sides. Jack could feel his heart racing in his chest, but it was not fear that gripped him. It was something else, something deeper. He was standing beside Ayasha, ready to fight for something greater than himself, for a future that was uncertain but worth the risk. The warriors on both sides were poised, waiting for the signal. Every movement, every breath felt amplified in the tense silence. Then, the Lakota leader raised his hand, signaling the start. The warriors moved like a single unit, their horses kicking up the earth beneath them as they began to advance. Jack's mind was focused entirely on the present moment, his every sense heightened. He had trained for this. He had fought many battles in his life, but this was different. This was not just a fight for survival. This was a fight for honor, for people he had come to care about. Ayasha rode at the front of the Apache warriors, her face determined, her eyes locked on the Lakota leader. Jack rode beside her, ready to lend his support, his hands steady on the reins of his horse. They were united in their purpose. As the Lakota warriors drew closer, Jack could see the tension in their faces, the same resolve that mirrored his own. There was no hatred in their eyes, no malice, just the shared understanding that this was what had to be done. Jack had always thought of himself as a man who stood alone, but now, surrounded by Ayasha and the Apache warriors, he realized that strength came from unity. The clash of horses' hooves and the sharp commands of both leaders filled the air as the battle began. But Jack was not focused on the battle itself. He was focused on Ayasha, on her strength, her unwavering courage. She was leading her people, not just into battle, but into a new chapter of their history. He had seen it in her eyes the moment they had met. This was not just about survival. It was about preserving their way of life, their dignity. As the fight raged on, Jack could hear the sounds of warriors shouting, the clash of weapons ringing in the air. But amidst the chaos, there was something peaceful about it all. The warriors were not fighting out of hatred, but out of necessity. They fought because they had no choice. They fought because their way of life depended on it. Jack's horse maneuvered through the chaos, carrying him swiftly and with purpose. He saw Ayasha in the distance, guiding her warriors with ease. Her presence was like a beacon, cutting through the turmoil around them. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as he watched her. She was a leader in every sense of the word, a woman who had the courage to stand up for her people, even when the odds were against her. Hours passed as the battle wore on, and as the sun began to set, the sounds of the clash finally began to die down. The Lakota warriors, though fierce, had been overwhelmed by the Apache's unity and strength. Jack could see the determination in their eyes as they slowly retreated, their backs turned as they left the field. It was over. The Apache had won. Ayasha rode toward Jack, her face still set with determination, but there was a glimmer of relief in her eyes. She had led her people to victory. Jack felt a wave of pride wash over him, knowing that he had played a part in this victory, knowing that he had stood by Ayasha's side when it mattered most. "We did it," Ayasha said, her voice soft, but filled with a quiet strength. Jack nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "We did," he said. As the Apache warriors began to celebrate, Jack looked out over the field, the setting sun casting a golden light over the land. It was a peaceful moment, a moment of triumph. And in that moment, Jack realized that he had found something he never expected, something far greater than any victory. He had found a family. A place where he truly belonged. In the days that followed the victory, life on the ranch slowly returned to a new sense of normal. The sun rose each morning over the vast, open land, casting a warm golden light across the fields. But there was something different now, a sense of purpose in the air, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. Jack Thompson stood on the porch of his cabin, looking out over the horizon, his hand resting on the railing. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of fresh grass and the promise of a new season. Ayasha had stayed, at least for now. Her people, once nomadic, had decided to settle near Jack's ranch, creating a new home in the land that had once been a place of solitude for him. At first, Jack wasn't sure how to feel about the change. He had always valued his solitude, his independence. But as the days passed, he realized that this was a new chapter in his life, one that he had never expected, but one that he was slowly beginning to embrace. Ayasha had become more than just an ally in battle, she had become a true friend, a partner in this journey. She was a woman of quiet strength, but there was a fire in her, a determination that inspired him every day. They worked side by side, planning the future, rebuilding, and strengthening the bond between their people. Jack found himself looking to her for guidance, just as she had once looked to him. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about building something lasting, something they could be proud of. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Jack and Ayasha stood together by the edge of the ranch, watching the sky turn to a brilliant orange. They had spent the day working in the fields, but now there was a quiet stillness between them. "I never thought I would be here," Jack said, his voice soft. Ayasha looked at him, her gaze steady. "Where else would you be?" she asked, a slight smile on her lips. Jack chuckled softly. "I thought I was meant to live alone. But I've come to realize that sometimes, the greatest strength comes from standing together." Ayasha nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We all have our paths to walk," she said. "But sometimes those paths cross in ways we never expect. And when they do, we find something greater than we could have ever imagined." Jack turned to her, his heart full. "I never knew what it meant to have a family," he said quietly. "But now I do." Ayasha smiled, the warmth of her expression reaching her eyes. "You are not alone, Jack. You never were. And you never will be." The words lingered between them as they stood side by side, watching the stars begin to appear in the night sky. In that moment, Jack felt something shift deep within him. The life he had known, the life he had always thought was enough, had changed. He wasn't just a cowboy anymore. He was part of something much larger, a family, a community. And for the first time, he felt truly at peace. The days ahead would bring new challenges, but with Ayasha and her people by his side, Jack knew he was ready. Together they would face whatever came their way, and together they would build a future. The land stretched out before them, vast and endless, but now it felt full of possibilities. Jack knew that this was just the beginning of their story, and no matter what the future held, he was no longer walking it alone.